Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tony Wheeler.
Thank you very much. Actually, probably a very well-known gentleman from Frankston spoke at the Wheeler Centre last Friday and played his bagpipes before he launched in. So I should probably be apologising for not having my bagpipes with me here this morning. But we're going to go back many years in this little talk. And I grew up I was born in Britain. I didn't turn up in Australia until many years later, which you will shortly see. But I lived overseas most of my younger life. I did all my high school years in America, as my father was working there. And then I came back to England and I did engineering at university, and I worked as a automotive development engineer for a couple of years, and then went back to university to do an MBA. And let me find the correct switch here. Where is it? Oh, we've got it here. Here we go. Does it work? No, it doesn't. Someone, what do I point it at?
I'm not sure what's working. You keep going.
We'll get it up. Anyway, the next photograph we're going to see was actually, it looks like when we do get it going, the technology is wonderful, isn't it? It worked perfectly before I came here. There we are.
This isn't working just here.
Just there, okay. It looks like I'm about 16 and my wife is 12. But actually, we've been married about 9 months, and she was 22 and I was 24 or 25. And I just graduated from London Business School. And we decided we'd take a year off and get travel out of our system. So we bought an old car, a Mini, and we set out to drive this car as far east as it would take us. And we thought, look, if it breaks down, it's so cheap, we'll just park it by the roadside and walk away. So we drove it across Europe and then across into Turkey and across Turkey. And in the background, you can see Mount Ararat. That's where Noah is said to have landed his ark, at the top of that. And this car, which we paid about $150 for, carried on all the way across Turkey. It carried on across Iran. It took us all the way to Afghanistan. We're actually just on the border of Afghanistan when I took that photograph. And in Afghanistan, we sold it for about a $5 profit. And I was telling people for years that it was probably Osama bin Laden's getaway vehicle. And if they could have tracked that car down, they wouldn't have had to have all this raids on houses in Pakistan. They would have known exactly where he was. We sold the car. We carried on by various other means of transport across Pakistan and India and down to Bangkok. And we hitchhiked from Bangkok all the way down to Singapore, Maureen beside the road in Thailand. And we got down to Singapore, and then we got a boat across to a ship to Indonesia, and we went down to Bali. And this is 1972, many years ago. So Bali wasn't the big tourist destination it's become today. In fact, nowhere else that we'd gone to had been the big tourist destinations they are today. But in Bali, we met some New Zealanders with a yacht, and we hitched a ride on their yacht. Actually, the guy who owned that yacht is now the head of the tourism department in Tonga, and I went sailing with him in Tonga earlier this year. Anyway, we got a ride on that yacht, and we sailed down to Australia, and we stepped ashore on the beach in Exmouth. And when that photograph was taken, Maureen and I had been living in Australia for about 30 seconds. Of course, if this was 30 years later, we would have been straight to Nauru, and I wouldn't be here speaking to you this morning. But in 1972, it was fine. And they actually, the immigration guy there is an immigration guy at Exmouth, because at that point there was a US naval communications base there as well. And the immigration guy said, "Are you visitors or immigrants?" And we said, "Oh, is there a difference?" And he said, "Well, not really. But he said, if you decide to be an immigrant, you get medical insurance for nothing for 3 months." And we thought, okay, well, there's a bargain. So we said we were immigrants, and we're still here today. Well, we hitchhiked down to Perth. We hitched across the Nullarbor, and we arrived in Sydney a day after Christmas, 1972. And the car dropped us off in Martin Place. And Maureen said, "Well, here we are. We've made it all the way from London to Australia. How much money do we have left?" And I put my hand in my pocket, and I pulled out 27 cents. And that was it. We literally had 27 cents when we arrived, and we knew nobody. It was long before credit cards. I had a camera, and we went up to King's Cross, and I got $25 for my camera from a loan shop. And that's the start of what we did. Anyway, we both got jobs, and we got a flat, and we settled down. And then people started asking us about what we'd done, where we'd been, how we'd done it. And we decided someone should write a book about it, and we wrote the first Lonely Planet guidebook. Across Asia on the cheap. It sold for all of $1.80. And to our absolute amazement, it was a success. People really liked it immediately. And we thought, well, this was fun. Let's do another book. So we bought a motorcycle, and for the next year, all of 1974, we rode that motorcycle around Southeast Asia. And at the end of 1974, we sat down in a little backstreet hotel in Singapore, stayed there for 3 months while we put together the second Lonely Planet guide, Southeast Asia on a Shoestring, which is still in, I think it's the 15th or something edition now, maybe more than that. It sold well over 1 million copies and is available in all sorts of other languages as well. So that was the start of Lonely Planet, and we traveled a lot. We had other people join us, and the company grew and grew, and eventually that's the view from the roof of Lonely Planet across the docks, and the company's in Footscray. It's a view inside the office, and I'm standing in front of the office building there with an Italian who's just ridden around the world 3 times on his Vespa and dropped in to say hello at Lonely Planet when he came through. But Maureen and I ran Lonely Planet for nearly 40 years and eventually decided it wasn't going to become a family dynasty and it was time to move on. But by that time, Lonely Planet had done all sorts of things. And one of the things that I really like about Lonely Planet today is it is big in all sorts of languages apart from English. These are regional guides to China. They're different regions of China, produced in Chinese by Chinese writers. But we sent Lonely Planet, some of our writers who spoke Chinese, to go over there to train them how to write a guidebook. They had no experience of going around checking out hotels, deciding which restaurant was best, deciding what attractions you should see and how to get from one city to another. And anybody who's used Lonely Planet guides would look at those and think, yeah, that's a Lonely Planet guide. But you wouldn't have a clue which region of China it's about. I mean, I can only recognize some of them because I know what the photographs relate to. But I was in China twice last year for Lonely Planet, and the young Chinese have this enthusiasm. They really want to get out there and travel. They want to see the world. And they want to use Lonely Planet guides when they do it. Lonely Planet is a big name in China, so much so that about 3 years ago, when BMW were launching the Mini in China, they asked me if I would come to China to help launch it. They said, yeah, it's a car for aspirational young people. They're young kids, younger people in China with money. They're people who also want to travel, so they know Lonely Planet. And we also know that you drove to Afghanistan in a Mini all those years ago. So I flew to China, and I got out of the plane at the airport and came out and met the BMW people. And they said, see that Mini Cooper S over there with the top down, a convertible? Here's the keys to it. We've set the sat-nav up for your hotel. Off you go. And they just launched me out into Chinese traffic, driving a Cooper S convertible. I thought, what a bargain, what a great thing. Anyway, we did sell Lonely Planet about 5 years ago. We sold it to the BBC, and the BBC have since subsequently sold it to an American company, NC2 Media. But we've done lots of things since then. One of the things is the money that we got, a lot of the money we got from selling Lonely Planet. We already had a foundation within Lonely Planet called the Lonely Planet Foundation. But we couldn't sell the business and say, oh, by the way, you've bought a foundation as well. So Maureen and I took the foundation out. We renamed it Planet Wheeler. Our daughter helps to run it. We've got about 70 projects, mainly education and health in the developing world. Hospitals, schools, all sorts of things, principally in Southeast Asia and East Africa. But also the Wheeler Centre, where your member of local parliament was speaking recently. That's Maureen and I in front of the Wheeler Centre, which is in the State Library building in the centre of Melbourne. It's one of the things we're involved in. The education and health projects, I stayed at a school when I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa about 3 years ago, and I stayed at the school that we helped to sponsor, St. Jude's in Arusha in Tanzania, some of the kids at the school there. The Lonely Planet, not the Lonely Planet solar system, the Melbourne solar system, which runs along the bayside. There's the sun at 1 to 1 billion scale outside St. Kilda Marina. It runs right along the bayside all the way to Port Melbourne if you want to get to the planet Pluto. And I helped put that together with the artists who dreamed it up. The Melbourne Ring Cycle last year, for any Wagnerian opera enthusiast, My wife Maureen was the major sponsor of that and also put an awful lot of work into getting that off the ground. She was the one who convinced Opera Australia would go, and it was a big success. And we're really hoping it will come to Melbourne again in 3 years' time, the Olympics of opera. I'm on the board of an American archaeology organization called Global Heritage Fund, and I go around looking at the tourism potential for their archaeology sites. And this is work they were doing on a temple in Cambodia. I've just been in Turkey looking at some of their projects last month. Lots of other things. But also I still travel a lot, and I get to do some really weird and wonderful travel things. I wasn't on that rocket. But Eric Anderson, who runs a company called Space Adventures, said, I'm taking 12 people down to Baikonur in Kazakhstan to see a Soyuz space launch. Do you want to come? And I said, sure, why not? So I went to Moscow, and I spent a day at the Cosmonaut Training Center. And then we flew down to Baikonur in a rather shonky old Toyota Tupolev. And one of the nice things about seeing this launch is they let you stand really close. As you can see from these two guys you got covered in dust when the damn thing went up. And there were some people from NASA were there, and they said if this was Cape Canaveral, we'd be 4 kilometers away in a concrete bunker. And instead we're standing, it's just about sort of over there. You felt it as it took off. It was just amazing. But the really amazing thing about this was the reason Eric Anderson was going down there is there are the 3 people who are going up into the space capsule. The gentleman in the middle is the Russian cosmonaut, mission commander. The guy on this side is a NASA astronaut, and NASA have paid to send him up to the International Space Station for 6 months. The guy on the far side is only going up to the space station for 2 weeks, but he's a tourist. He's paid to go up there. He's a computer game entrepreneur. And if you want to go up to the International Space Station, all you have to do is speak to Eric Anderson and he'll organize it for you. There are 3 requirements. First, there is the ticket price, which is about $30 million at the moment. You do get 2 weeks up there. It's not just, up and straight back down again, like Richard Branson's proposing. Plus, you have to learn to speak Russian, because they require that you can communicate with mission control and so on. And when they say, don't press that button, you have to be able to understand that in Russian. And you have to do a 6-month training course at the Cosmonaut Training Center in Moscow. And we spent a day there seeing what they go through in that 6 months. Anyway, Richard Garriott was going up, and his father was a real NASA astronaut, and Richard had become extraordinarily rich from computer games and spent 30 million of his money going up there. What was equally interesting about going down, who the other 12 people were that I went down there with. There we are watching the thing being fueled, and there's Larry Page and Sergey Brin of Google. They were there to watch the space launch. The guy in the middle, Charles Simoni, had actually been up there once. He'd spent the $30 million and gone up. He'd made his money. He was one of the first 20 people at Microsoft, and he did the programming for Excel and for Word, and made a lot of money from it, and spent 30 million of it going up to the space station for 2 weeks. And actually, there was a problem. He had to spend another 2 weeks. He had a month up there. But liked it so much that he subsequently spent another 30 million and gone up again. He got no frequent flyer miles. He didn't get a cheaper flight next time, but he did that. So great stuff. So I'm going the wrong way there. We'll get back. But I continue to write books, and I wrote a book about 5 years ago, and I've subsequently updated it, called Badlands. And I say George Bush made me write it, because as soon as George Bush said there are these 3 countries that are so bad, so terrible that they make an axis of evil, my first thought was, well, I want to go there. I mean, who wouldn't? I mean, it was like a challenge. Iran, Iraq, North Korea, let's go and see it. And I talked about this book last year in China, and I showed pretty much this same slide. And it was written up in the Chinese press, and it came out in the Chinese press as George Bush asked me to write it, which wasn't quite correct. But it was a lot of fun. I went back to Iran, and when I was a car engineer all those years ago, I worked for Roots and then Chrysler in the UK, and there was the car I actually helped to design, the Hillman Hunter, which was Iran bought the whole factory off Roots, and they continued to make Hillman Hunters in Iran for the next 40 years. And I really wanted to get a picture of the Hillman Hunter and the Ayatollah in the background. So I went back to Iran. I went to Iraq. There I am being welcomed by some Peshmerga soldiers from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. When I went into Iraq, I just turned up on the border and said, can I come and visit Iraq? And they said, sure. I went to Albania, a country that locked itself away from the world for 40-odd years. I went back to Afghanistan about 5 years ago, and there we are with some dumped Russian equipment. That isn't the Russian tank commander on the back, it's a donkey herder sitting in the back of that Afghan tank. Back to Cuba, and I was back in Cuba again just a few months ago. The old American cars seem to be getting younger and younger. Every time I go back to Cuba, they look like they've been repainted again and look in better shape than ever. I went to Libya when Gaddafi was still in power. I really thought that he loved having these posters and billboards of himself all over the country. And the thing was, Gaddafi was really the Michael Jackson of dictators. He just liked to dress up in these different outfits. This is the Desert Sheik outfit. And then he had the army commander outfit, but it was the Sergeant Pepper school of army uniforms. And he had his naval uniform, and that was from the HMS Pinafore school of naval uniforms. So you went around the country seeing Gaddafi in all these different crazy outfits. And, well, he was definitely a bad ruler and deserved to be in Badlands. I went to Saudi Arabia. Well, they supplied most of the people who hijacked the planes back in 9/11, so Saudi Arabia was definitely a bad country to visit. I went to Burma again, a country that's caused me lots of trouble over the years, and these three gentlemen are called the Mustache Brothers, and they're Burmese comedians, and two of them got sentenced to 7 years hard labor for telling jokes about the government. I mean, there was a government that definitely needed replacing. All three of them are out of prison now, and I visited them in Mandalay on that visit to the country. But the weirdest country I visited was North Korea. I have never been to a country as absolutely bizarrely strange as North Korea. It was just fascinating to visit. And everywhere you went in the country, again, you found these big posters and billboards and statues and everything else. Fantastic. And here, this one was like a sort of a pool. I could see it at the bottom of a swimming pool. It was a mosaic of the great leader Kim Il-sung and the son Kim Jong-il. We're now on to Kim Jong-un. And this was supposedly where he led the fight against the Japanese during World War II, hiding out in this little log cabin. It's completely false because he was actually in Russia at the time that Kim Jong-il was born. But everything in North Korea is sort of halfway false or completely false. The dear and great leader surveying another bountiful harvest. No mention about famines and millions of people starving to death. The country is totally bizarre. The wonderful subway. The subway is like something out of Disneyland. It's a mixture of the best subway stations in Moscow and the best ones in Paris. But the real highlight of going to Pyongyang is seeing a mass games. You've got this stadium the size of the MCG, 100,000 people stadium. And then tens of thousands of, in this case, children doing the Wimbledon of Pyongyang. They don't have a Pyongyang Open, and probably the only time they ever hold a tennis racket is when they're performing down the stage. But tens of thousands of kids out on the stadium floor doing these gymnastics. And then the lights dim, and tens of thousands of women come out. And in the background, these cards flip up to make different pictures. And you see this picture of Pyongyang at night in the winter, and it's like a cold breeze blows across, and all the women sway one way and sway the other way. And again, it's completely false, because in Pyongyang, you look out across the city at night, and there's no lights at all, because they haven't got enough electricity. But at the stadium, all of this happens. And then the cards flip over again, and there we have the military, and the army comes marching out onto the stadium floor. And when the army gets out on the stadium floor, what do? They dance. I mean, when it comes to dancing, the North Korean army is the absolute tops. When we decide wars by whose army dances best, my money is totally on the North Koreans, because I have never seen an army dance like the North Korean army could dance. Well, I say that until I did another book. Having done Badlands, I had lots of bad places I would like to have put into Badlands, but didn't have room for them. So I did a second book, which just came out last year, called Darklands. And there it is, Darklands, on sale. I've got a couple of copies here if anybody wanted one. Darklands, which covered 8 more dark countries rather than bad ones. starting off with Pakistan. And I went to the border where India meets Pakistan, and every night they shut the border until dawn the next day, or 9 o'clock next day. And the border closure is the most amazing process, with the two armies of Pakistan and India dancing off against each other. They choose their tallest men, so these guys are all over 6 foot tall, and then they put big hats on their heads, and then they dance on both sides of the border as they close the gates. And there we are, that's the Indian army marching out to do their dance. It's just fabulous to watch. It's become a major tourist attraction. And then they try and kick their hats off their head. And if you're really good, you can kick your hat right off your head. It's definitely worth seeing. There he is putting his hat back on his head afterwards. So anyway, I went and I watched the border close that night, and then I went back to Amritsar and spent the night in a hotel by the Golden Temple. And the next morning I came back and took the bus. I crossed over to Lahore and took the bus to Rawalpindi. And Maureen, who'd been in Paris, flew in to meet me in Rawalpindi. The big mosque, and Rawalpindi actually is remarkably like Canberra. It really looks like it's a purpose-designed capital city. Not Rawalpindi, Islamabad, sorry. Rawalpindi and Islamabad are sort of side by side. Islamabad is remarkably like Canberra, surrounded by mountains. This wonderful big mosque, and the Pakistan story is that the minarets look rather like missiles, and the American CIA had been investigating them to see if they really were missiles and aimed at them. Anyway, my hotel room that night, I had a Murray beer, which is quite interesting because beer, of course, is like everything else, banned in Pakistan. And yet Murray is one of the most successful companies on the Pakistani stock exchange. And you actually get to sort of sign a little thing. There's no bar in the hotel, but they will deliver you a bottle of beer to your hotel room. But you first of all have to sort of sign a disclaimer, which more or less says, I am an alcoholic, and if I don't get a beer tonight, I'm going to die. And then they send you up a man with a beer and a chilled glass on a tray, and you sign, and I think it was $2.50 or something. I felt I really had to have a beer before I left Islamabad. Anyway, Maureen and we started off up the Karakoram Highway. We'd got a car and a driver. And this is this amazing road that goes up through the north of Pakistan and then over the tail end of the Himalayas and down into China. And we started off thinking we were in Australia because the roads were lined with eucalypts. And it was also raining, as you can see. But almost the first place we stopped was a town called Abbottabad. And we stopped and looked at the Methodist church, and then we stopped in a restaurant there. And this, of course, is where Osama bin Laden was finally tracked down. You know, he could have just hopped into church there if he got fed up with Islam. He could have decided he'd become a Methodist instead. Maybe he even sent out for takeaways from the place we had lunch there. We carried on up the highway, and it is just an amazing road. You know, it winds through the mountains, and keeping it open is a major feat. And we met lots of interesting people. Maureen and I at a kaichana, a roadside tea house. It was unfortunately the time when this movie had come out that had caused a lot of problems, and there were riots in various parts of Pakistan while we were there. And yet everybody was extraordinarily friendly to us. But of course we saw lots of traffic. You know, the buses and the trucks like this one are real works of art. They could be in art galleries. They're all painted. Every single square centimetre of them is covered over in decoration, and they're great things to see. We also saw quite a lot of rock carvings as we went up, which showed there was a sort of pre-Islamic time in Pakistan. These are Buddhist rock carvings and statues of the Buddha carved out in the roadside. The Rakaposhi Viewpoint Hotel, and I thought after we stopped there for lunch one day, and I thought if ever a place was deserving an award for truth in advertising, the Rakaposhi Viewpoint Hotel deserved it, because we sat in the little garden beside the hotel looking out, and there was the view. And you felt like you could just walk down to the bottom of the garden, keep walking for about 5 miles, and then start climbing. And you'd be at the top of this 7,000-meter mountain, just Mount Rakaposhi, just sitting there. But one of the problems we had was this road is very unstable, and it keeps on having landslides, and the road gets blocked. And we got here, and it was blocked, and we were only stuck there for about 3 hours while the bulldozers came along, quite close by, fortunately, and cleared the landslide. But on another occasion, we were stopped for a day, and we had to retreat back to a town we'd come through and spend another day in the hotel there and carry on while they cleared the road. And I asked our driver, I said, what's the worst does this happen all the time? And he said, I never drive up this road without being stopped at least for a few hours and very often for a day or more. And I said, well, what's the longest you were ever stopped? And he said, well, there was one occasion when I was stuck while they cleared the road for 21 days. And I thought, well, I've got a flight out of China in a week's time. So fortunately, this wasn't a 21-day stoppage. But a little bit further on from that, some great hotels. This was the doorman of one of the hotels. Of course, the really sad thing about this is there are no tourists in Pakistan at the moment, for very good reasons. And yet these delightful hotels, this was an old fort that was converted into a hotel, and the doorman was really pleased to have some guests staying there. Karimabad, a beautiful town. It could be the Kathmandu of Pakistan, with a fortress overlooking the town. And again, just no tourists in town. There was one other there, and of course she was Australian. But we then reached this sign, with a little sign saying, sorry for inconvenience. And the inconvenience was they'd had a landslide that was so big, it hadn't just covered the road, it had covered the whole valley. And then the river that came down started backing up behind this landslide, and it backed up for the next 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, it had submerged about 7 villages. They had lots of time to get out because the water just gradually crept up. But these 7 villages were totally underwater. So the road was interrupted for about 20 kilometers by this gigantic landslide. And I'm down at the water side now, looking up. That's the landslide. There's the road coming down the landslide now, down to the water's edge. And we met some Chinese there, and we chartered a little boat with them. It's our boat. And we're getting on there. We left our car there and crossed the what is now a lake to continue up on the other side. There we are, traveling up the Karakoram Highway into the mountains, except it's, at this point, not a highway anymore, it's a lake. But we got there. There's the border between between Pakistan and China. One of the highest borders in the world. I've forgotten the altitude at the moment, but it's extraordinarily high. If you walk more than about 50 meters, you start to get breathless because of the altitude you're at, and it's difficult for the vehicles to get over it as well. And then this amazing contrast from friendly Pakistan into extraordinarily unfriendly China, as we were coming into the district where they're having so much trouble at the moment, and they distrust everybody there, the Uyghur people there. Anyway, we got to Tashkurgan, the first town in China, with this, again, amazing fortress right in the middle of the town. And we went up to Kashgar. There's a statue of Mao in the middle of Kashgar. And that was the end of that trip, one of the trips in Darklands. I went to Colombia, a country which has had an enormous amount of trouble over the years, but is getting over that trouble today. And it's a country with just wonderful architecture. The architecture is fabulous. The guy who runs the best backpacker hostel in Bogota in Colombia, his name is Escobar, actually, which, if you know the drug lord Escobar, but he said in Colombia Escobar is quite a common name. There's lots of Escobars. And funnily enough, his hostel, he's got a little boutique hotel now with more or less the same name, is called the Platypus Hostel. And he said, because before he started it up, he'd done a lot of travel himself, and everywhere I went, he said, I bumped into Australians. And they were always great travelers, and I always got on really well with them. And I decided I would go back to Colombia, and I'd open a backpacker hostel, and I would call it the Platypus Hostel, after all those Australians. And he's now got the Platypus Hostel and the Platypus Boutique Hotel as well. He's doing very well. With my archaeology organization, I went to Ciudad Perdida, the lost city, which is the Machu Picchu of Colombia. To get there, you have to walk through the jungle for 3 days, which does put tourists off a little bit, but it's definitely, if you go to Colombia, it's worth seeing. I went back to Zimbabwe, a country which has had all sorts of problems, of course, due to Mr. Mugabe. But I went back there, and I was actually with a game guide there, and we walked over to the railway, which marks the boundary of one of the parks, and this elephant decided it would come by at the same moment and dispute ownership with the train coming by. But Zimbabwe has the best ruins south of the Sahara. And this is one of this is not Great Zimbabwe, the most important of the ruins, but it's another one which is just an amazing sight to see. One of the things I also came back with, I've still got it in my wallet today, is I always say, if I ever need, a really big sum of money, I've got the $100 trillion note. I do actually, if anyone wants to see it, it's in my wallet. I carry it around all the time. And this was the last note. When they got to all those zeros, they decided, forget it. And now if you go to Zimbabwe and you go to an ATM machine and put your card in, you get US dollars out. And that sort of actually has helped to get the Zimbabwe economy going again. I went to Israel and Palestine, a place which, is it one country? Is it two countries? Is it no country? That's the dividing wall between Israel and the West Bank. And we're on the Palestine side of the wall, of course, at this point, because there's Yasser Arafat painted on the wall. And here I joined the Palestinians queuing up to get into Israel. And it's really it's an airport security queue. You're going to go through a metal detector and have your bag put through the X-ray machine, but the entrance to it is more like going through a cattle shed. It was, and that was an element of many things I found very interesting there and very disquieting. I did quite a lot of walking there. I did some walking down in the Negev desert with an Israeli friend of mine and his son in front there. We were walking on the Israel National Trail, but I also did some walking in the West Bank with I had a guide who lived in a refugee camp in Palestine. We're walking through the olive groves on the West Bank. And I did some walking up in the Sea of Galilee region with two Israelis there. I was with a third Israeli at a village, what had been a Palestinian village that was evacuated in 1948 when the Israelis came over and basically kicked everybody out. So I went there, another interesting dark country. I went to Nauru, our own darkest little country, Australia's prison camp. I went up there to have a look around. Of course, Nauru briefly was the richest country in the world per capita, and then they burnt all that money. So I went to Nauru, and actually just before I went there, I was at a talk in Sydney where Alexander Downer was speaking, and somebody asked him what's the worst place he'd ever been to, and without hesitation he said, Nauru, which I guess was how they decided to make it the prison camp. I went on to, there's the loading equipment all falling apart in Nauru because they're not exporting that guano superphosphate anymore. And of course the heaviest people in the world in Nauru, enormous diabetes rates. The people in the camps are not getting diabetes, but the Nauruans certainly are. I went to Haiti, the tragic little country in the Caribbean, which has a heroic history. It's Toussaint Louverture who kicked out the French. He was a slave who rose up against the French. Anyway, the Capitol building, and that was before the earthquake. I was there shortly before the earthquake. And then I went there again after. There's the Capitol building again after the earthquake demolished it. It caused huge damage in the country. I stayed in the Olofsson Hotel, which is a great place to stay in Haiti, because that was the swimming pool that, if anybody's read The Comedians, the famous Graham Greene novel about Haiti and Papa Doc, and the book starts off with one of Papa Doc's politicians being found dead in that swimming pool, which was drained out empty in the book. But it's great to be able to swim up and down this swimming pool and think, well, I'm swimming in a swimming pool that has a famous fictional appearance in a great novel. Inside the Olofsson Hotel, it looks exactly the way that Graham Greene describes it. And he says you come into the hotel, you turn to the left, and there's the bar. And sure enough, you turn to the left, and there is the bar. Down in the south, they've got this citadel, which is the most amazing man-made construction anywhere in the Caribbean. And the fact they get no tourists is sort of illustrated by this. Because if they had any tourists, it's about a 500-meter drop straight down from the side, and then you're on the side of a mountain, so it's another 500 meters down before you land. And the fact they let people just sort of walk out to the edge like that, if they had any tourists there, they would definitely have some sort of fence around it. The buses, they're just fantastic. They're called tap-taps. And every single one is decorated like this. Here's Schwarzenegger painted on the back of one of the buses. Wouldn't the buses in Frankston look a lot better if we had a few artists from Haiti to come here and paint them up for us? But the Olofsson Hotel, every Thursday night, puts on a music session until the early hours of the morning. And it is just the most amazing thing to be at. The music is just fantastic in Haiti. And Maureen and I, you can just sort of see Maureen down at the edge of the crowd down there. We were in Haiti and listening to the music one Thursday night. I went to Bougainville in Papua New Guinea because, of course, Bougainville is a place which it's on our border. Papua New Guinea has all sorts of problems. Bougainville had even more of them. But I started off there from the Solomon Islands. I went out to this, I stayed in this little resort, and the island at the edge there is Kennedy Island, and that's where JFK swam after PT-109 was sunk. He swam there, his boat was run down by a Japanese destroyer, and I borrowed a little kayak from the resort, and it's about 2 kilometers out there, and I paddled across and landed on that same beach where JFK landed all those years ago, the American president. That was a great experience. But then I managed to find the immigration department, and because I was going to leave the country illegally. What I did was I flew up to the furthest north island in the country called Shortland. I was the only one flight a week. There were 9 people on the flight. I was one of them. There's the airport transport taking me from the airport into the little village on Shortland Island, and there's the one and only hotel, the St. Rose of Lima guest house, which I stayed at. I was the only person staying there, and I was the first person to stay there for 3 months. But I stayed there, and then I hitched a ride. That's a boat that had come into the mission, and the kids were playing and jumping off it. I'm jumping back. There was an amazing bit of Japanese war crime on that airport, and which if anyone reads the book, they can find out all about. And a lot of Japanese aircraft wreckage on that island as well. You poke into the jungle and you find aircraft with the rising sun painted on. There's a Betty bomber I found in the jungle there, lying just off the runway. Anyway, I hitched a ride on this little boat, and I hitched a ride across to New Guinea. We just crossed about 30 kilometers of open sea with no life jackets, of course, and an outboard motor, which I'm waiting to fail at any moment, and then you'll drift off for 6 months. But we crossed over to New Guinea, and we landed on the beach. Here we are coming ashore on the beach. And I hitched a ride into the nearest town. There's the vehicle I hitched a ride with. But of course, this is all totally illegal because there's no immigration point there. So I went into the police station and I said, look, I'm really sorry about this, but I've turned up in your country and I know there isn't an immigration point here and I shouldn't have done it. And they said, oh, that's fine. They stamped in this stamp says reported to police station. They stamped in my passport that I'd been to the police station. And they said, when you get somewhere where there's an immigration office, sort it out there. I didn't get to an immigration office for 10 days. So I'd been illegally in New Guinea for 10 days when I got to the immigration office. They said, that's fine, you did the right thing, you went to the police station, stamp, great. It's wonderful in the world today, you can still do these sort of things. But what I really wanted to do when I was there is I wanted to see Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft. Admiral Yamamoto was the Japanese admiral who plotted the attack on Pearl Harbor. And if there was an occasion before bin Laden where the Americans got public enemy number 1, it was here where they shot down his aircraft in the jungle. And it's still there 70 years later. This gentleman with the machete is taking me there. And it was quite a story in getting to this. But there it is. It's another Betty bomber. And it's been lying there in the jungle for the last 70 years. It's quite and of course, it's an area where no tourists get to. So you feel really quite out there seeing it. There's the wreckage lying there. Great. We continued up the road on the coast of Bougainville. And as you can see, the road's got a few problems. We had to stop here and sort of move the boards around to get the Land Cruiser across. What I really wanted to see up here was I wanted to go to see the mine, the huge mine there, which has been abandoned now for 30-odd years. And it's like a sort of scene out of Mad Max because everything is gone, and you can tell this used to be a Shell petrol station, with the Shell sign is still there, but there's no petrol station there anymore. And we went up to the mine. This is one of the rebels are still sort of semi in control of it and charge you to go up to the mine. That's the entrance. And when you get there, this gigantic mine is still there. And all the trucks are all still lined up on the road because Rio Tinto, who owned that mine, when everything started to go wrong there, they said, oh, this will get sorted out in a couple of weeks. Just park the trucks and we'll close it down. And we're sure we'll be back in a few weeks. Well, they never got back. The mine's been abandoned now for more than 20 years. Now there's more of the trucks just lined up, and there's me standing in front of one of those trucks. These kids, this was the mining town there. You can see the abandoned apartments in the back. This was the outdoor 50-meter Olympic-sized swimming pool. And you can see that's gone right back to the jungle and kids playing on the side of it. The apartment blocks where the miners used to live. This guy he was another local police officer, and I took him up to the mine. I'd rented a car, and he came up there as a guide. His father used to work at the mine. And you can see what we're in. We're in the mining town cinema. You can see the squares where the projector's projected. And there's the seats in the cinema. So it really was like going to one of these Mad Max scenes. You're going to a place that's disappeared and gone back. But the craziest place I went to was the Congo. I went to see the gorillas in the Congo, and gorillas are the most amazing creatures. This one just sitting there studying you, and they say you mustn't get too close to them, but the gorillas are quite happy to get close to you. So you stand there and they'll wander over to have a look at you. I went to Kisangani, where the Belgian paratroopers came in to try and put down the revolution that was going on. Here, when you got money out of an ATM, again it was US dollars that came out of the ATM, but then you needed local currency. And so you'd find these money traders on the street, and each of those little bands of money is $20 worth. So you really couldn't carry around much more than $20 worth at a time. So you go to an ATM machine and get a couple of $100, and then you go over to this guy and give him $40 and get 2 boxes of money to take away to spend locally. It was an interesting scene. A statue of Stanley fallen over in the museum in Kinshasa. A place that's full of great rock and roll music in Kinshasa. I'm being signaled that I've got 2 minutes now, but I am very nearly at the end. Great clothes. Boy, the markets, they turn out these jackets, and I wish I'd had time to get one made. Sad things you see. This was in a market in Kisangani, and these are smoked monkeys. And because of the war and farms being destroyed, people just kill anything they can that they can eat, and monkeys are one of the things. Slightly crowded ferry boat going across the river in Kisangani. I jumped on it and went over to look at the other side. The roads were always not that great, and when something broke down, you were stuck until they could get it off the road. Then I joined, there were a couple other tourists there, and we climbed up this mountain. We spent the whole afternoon climbing up. The best mountain I've ever climbed. When you get to the top, you look down into a crater, and it's like a kid's idea of what a volcano should be like. And when it got dark, it was just fabulous. The lava was spitting up. It was just an incredible sight. One of the highlights of that trip. But as this sign said in Indonesia, a few years ago in Bali, the beer manufacturer had just stolen our name and said, "It doesn't have to be a lonely planet." Maureen and I pointing up at our sign. Thank you very much.